Leading Adolescent Literacy, Leading Adolescent Literacy. I'm Brenda Warren, President of the Reading League Vermont, and I'm excited to see all of you here. I know you will learn a lot from our four speakers. We had a good presentation yesterday that you should check out if you missed it. Our chat will be open for you to ask questions during the presentation, and we will have time at the end to answer them. Also, I will be putting some information in the chat about an upcoming event, and also some resources that we have on our website, the TRL Vermont website. What the event we have upcoming is an in-person meeting for anyone interested in learning more about the Reading League Vermont on August 19th at the Stern Center from 10 to noon. There's information about this event also on our Facebook and Instagram pages, in case you're watching this on a recording. Our website also has resources under the Vermont Professional Resources tab, which includes recordings of this summer's and last summer's webinar series and past issues of Teaching Reading in Brief. Teaching Reading in Brief, for those of you who aren't on our mailing list, is a publication by Vermont educators to help our Vermont leaders learn more about structured literacy. At the end of this presentation, we will share a link to a survey you can fill out to receive a certificate of attendance. We will also be emailing a recording of this presentation, and the survey link will be on that also. And now I am pleased to welcome today's speaker, Abby Roy. Abby is a nationally certified school psychologist with over 15 years of professional experience working with students of all ages. She is currently an evaluator at the Stern Center and will be speaking to us about literacy assessment, purpose, tools, and practices from elementary to secondary. Abby?
Thank you, Brenda. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here and giving up some time over your summer break to be with us today. I really appreciate it. As Brenda mentioned, I'm an evaluator at the Stern Center, and I'm excited to talk with you about assessment today. Our objectives for today are to explore different types of assessments and when they should be used, learn characteristics of evidence-aligned reading assessments, and understand the role of reading assessment in the instructional process. So let's first think about why reading assessment matters. Assessment data helps us make informed decisions about instructional efficacy and pacing, interventions, and student groupings. If we collect the right data and use it effectively, it can help us to evaluate not only our systems of instruction and our curricula, but also give us student-specific information. It can also help us to intervene early, since we know poor readers in first grade continue to be poor readers, and that it takes longer to catch them up the longer we wait. In fact, Lyon and Fletcher found that it takes 4 times as long to remediate a student with poor reading skills in 4th grade compared to remediating in kindergarten or 1st grade. So good assessment can prevent unnecessary hardship for students and families, as well as ensure that we are using our limited resources effectively. So in this country, we also assess reading to see how we are doing, and the news, unfortunately, is not good. Our national reading scores are down in both 4th and 8th grade, according to the 2024 NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, sometimes called the nation's report card. And a common misperception is that students aged 13 to 18 are proficient readers. Yet the 2024 NAEP scores revealed that a third of 8th graders are not reading at a basic level, which is a greater percentage than ever before. So this means that they cannot identify basic literary elements such as order of events, character traits, and main idea. So this data tells us that many students continue through the education system without ever truly becoming proficient readers. I'd like to first give credit to my colleague and friend, Peggy Price, who created this slide to demonstrate the concerning downward trend in 8th grade scores over the last 22 years. So since this symposium is highlighting adolescent literacy, I thought it might be helpful to take a look at the data for 8th graders in Vermont. It took 20 years to go down 6 points, and now 2 years to go down just 5 points. So I think we can all agree that this is a pretty concerning trend. So the downward trend in our national reading scores has prompted many states to enact legislation intended to improve reading outcomes. Vermont has finally joined the party over the last couple years and passed some reading legislation that is relevant to our discussion about assessment today. So Act 139 is an act relating to supporting Vermont's young readers through evidence-based literacy instruction. It mandates the implementation of structured literacy approaches in grades K to 3. It requires regular assessment of student skills in grades K to 3, and it requires schools to inform parents about reading progress and intervention implementation. More recently, Act 72 includes language that requires schools to provide supplemental reading instruction to Vermont students in grades K to 12 who are below proficiency in reading. So if we are required to provide intervention to all struggling readers, regardless of age, we need to know where to intervene, which is why appropriate assessment is so important. And you all might be thinking, we already assess reading a lot. And I agree. We don't need to do more assessment. Instead, we need to shift to collecting the right data and knowing how to use it. The data needs to be instructionally relevant. No educator wants to spend precious instructional time testing students. So it's important to understand what goes into determining reading levels and reading scores to maximize instructional impact. Some assessments do not directly measure the skills we know align with proficient reading. Let me show you what I mean. Historically, many schools have used a leveled reading assessment system, such as Fountas and Pinnell's benchmark assessment system, to identify student skill with reading. So on this chart, it is labeled as F&P. Dr. Matt Burns collected this data set that compares students in the 2nd grade across a variety of assessment measures. So I want to draw your attention to students 6 and 7 in that red box there. So student 6 is performing at the 73rd percentile on the MAP assessment, is reading 80 words correct per minute with 98% accuracy. So those words correct per minute are on a common test of oral reading fluency, or ORF. Student 7 is performing in the 1st percentile on the MAP assessment, is only reading 26 words correct per minute on the same oral reading fluency assessment with 93% accuracy. These two readers are going to sound very different when you listen to them read. You could make a similar comparison with students 15 and 16 there at the bottom. Guess what? All 16 students were reading at an instructional level G, according to the Fountas and Pinnell benchmark assessment system. But these students have very different reading profiles and very different needs. So knowing that these students were successful with a level G book doesn't necessarily help us understand their individual strengths and weaknesses and how to teach them. We could be inadvertently grouping kids together who need different things. So this data highlights the variability that might exist within a classroom, as well as across various assessment measures. It depends on how different assessments are constructed and what specific skills they measure. So in this case, we need more information to understand where each learner is and how to tailor instruction to their skill set. So I would argue that using the F&P benchmark assessment system is not a very good use of our time. I think this quote from the research study itself sums it up well. Only about 1/4 of the time did the students read 93 to 97% of the words correctly when reading the book that was rated at their instructional level. It seems that the reading level assigned by the assessment did not align with how well the student could actually read text. And to that, you might say, aren't informal reading inventories more authentic? And I would ask you to consider this finding from a study on screening for reading difficulties by David Parker and colleagues in 2015. They gave an informal reading inventory and an oral reading fluency assessment to 968 second and third grade students, and then compared their performance on those measures with an established criterion of reading proficiency. They found that oral reading fluency, or ORF, assessment correctly identified which students were on track and which students were at risk 80% of the time, which is acceptable for a screening tool. However, the informal reading inventory only resulted in accurate classification of risk for 54% of the students assessed. So not only can informal reading inventories be inaccurate, but they can also be time consuming. In my experience, up to 45 minutes per student. If they're doing a running record, teachers need to write subplans and miss an entire day of instruction or more to obtain results that don't actually give them the information that they need. Now compare that to using an ORF measure, which is significantly faster, typically 1 minute. And to put that into context, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience using ORF in public schools. When I worked in the schools in the Chicagoland area, we gave the ORF to students 3 times per year as a universal screener, and the support staff were trained to give it. So each teacher would bring their classroom to the library at a scheduled time. And we used Ames Web, which recommended giving each student 3 probes and then taking the median score. So that's 3 minutes per student. So let's say a class had 25 students and we had 5 people assessing. It took approximately 15 minutes to screen an entire class. Something to think about. We can think about assessment in 4 broad categories. So each assessment type is used for a different purpose. A screening test is like taking your temperature. So if you have a high temperature, you know something is wrong, but you don't necessarily know what. Could be an infection, could be the flu, could be inflammation. We aren't going to treat these problems in the same way, so we need more information. Diagnostic assessments give us more information. So your doctor might do a blood test or a chest x-ray, for example. Progress monitoring lets us know if we are on the right path with treatment. So if we're trying to lower our cholesterol, for example, we might write down what we eat or how much we exercise to see if it correlates to reduced cholesterol or weight loss. And an outcome assessment helps us to determine if we met our goal. Did we reach our desired weight in this example? So let's talk about the features of universal screening tools. They should be done 3 times a year, fall, winter, and spring. And they assess performance in relation to age and grade level expectations. This is typically done using a standard score, a Lexile, or a percentile rank. But I do want to caution you against using age or grade level equivalents to describe a student's functioning or progress. They can be misleading because age and grade level equivalents do not have equal spaces between them. So a minor change in a raw score can lead to a major change in an age or grade equivalent. So they can't be subtracted. So you can't say Johnny jumped 2 grade levels. That's inaccurate. So I tend to avoid using age and grade level equivalents. Percentile ranks are much more helpful. So universal screening helps us to identify students who may need more diagnostic assessment, and it can help us evaluate the efficacy of our core instruction and resource allocation. So if we have more than 20% of our students not meeting a benchmark on a universal screener, then we might need to evaluate our core instruction. Screeners paint a broad picture based on a sampling of skills that are predictors of reading proficiency. They could be curriculum-based measures or computer adaptive tests. But the key question to ask yourself is, does your screener measure indicators that are predictive of reading proficiency? I took this chart from Sarah Brown and Stephanie Steller's new book, MTSS for Reading Improvement. And I like it because it highlights how efficient screening can be. We know through replicated studies that these measures are predictive of reading skills at certain ages. So, as I mentioned earlier, oral reading fluency is very efficient and it is a strong indicator of overall reading skills. It becomes a good predictor of reading skills by the middle of first grade. So, when a student does not meet the benchmark on a universal screener, a diagnostic assessment is necessary to figure out the why. Remember, the screener only tells us that something is wrong, but doesn't give us enough information about specific skills. Now, I do want to clarify that diagnostic assessment is, in this context, is not the same as making a diagnosis or identifying a learning disability. Okay? They're intended to help provide specific information to differentiate and appropriately focus instruction. So we get more in-depth picture of specific skills. And the goal is to match the student need to the right instruction, so the assessments must directly measure key reading skills. This quote from Susan Hall's book, 10 Success Factors for Literacy Intervention, highlights how important a diagnostic assessment is to inform instruction when you have concerns. She says the purpose of the diagnostic analysis is to learn more about what a student can and can't do in a particular area to inform decisions about the best instructional approach. So, in order to think about what we might want to look at in a diagnostic assessment, it's always helpful to revisit the simple view of reading, which says that reading is the product of word recognition and language comprehension, and that both parts are essential and should be developed simultaneously. And then Hollis Scarborough gave us a more detailed view of what skilled reading looks like. The reading rope is helpful because it identifies the sub-skills involved in both word recognition and language comprehension, which are the two strands that become increasingly more automatic and strategic as we gain more experience with reading. So if we are concerned about a struggling reader, we need to first identify which strand of the rope should we look at. Is it word recognition? Is it language comprehension? Is it both? Then you have to unravel the ropes to figure out which sub-skills to target for intervention. So if we know which skills are required to be a skilled reader, then doesn't it make sense that we make sure we are assessing those skills? One of the challenges with using screeners or outcome measures to assess progress or identify where to intervene with a struggling reader is that some of their sub-skills might be really strong and can mask weaker skills. So, in other words, a child can earn a score in the average range on a comprehension measure because of strong language skills and still be a poor decoder. This often happens with really bright students. They can employ compensatory strategies to comprehend, but the process is very effortful. It also becomes less and less effective as they get into middle and high school and encounter more unfamiliar words. So we can put all readers into one of these four categories. The first in yellow is a skilled reader who has strong decoding and strong language comprehension. In red, we have strong language comprehension and weak decoding skills, which is often what you see in a classic dyslexic profile. In green, both areas are weak. This profile requires the most intervention as the child will need work on decoding and language. And lastly, you can be a good decoder and have poor language comprehension. And sometimes you see this in children with autism who can decode the words, but they can't put the words together to make meaning from what they read because of impairments in their language system. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Big Five, which were the areas identified by the National Reading Panel in 2000 as key instructional areas for reading. I think it's a more practical approach to think about areas in which we want to assess and intervene. So sometimes we see this list flipped, but I wanted to start with comprehension because comprehension is the ultimate goal of reading. So if students can comprehend well, then we don't necessarily need to worry about the other areas. However, I do want to reiterate that many students can rely on their thinking and reasoning skills to comprehend, I'd say until about fourth or fifth grade. And very bright students can sometimes comprehend all the way through high school, but they have to work 5 times harder than everyone else because they're exhausted because they are using inefficient approaches to reading. Vocabulary is really closely related to comprehension and falls under that language strand of the reading rope that we just saw. And when we think about reading fluency, we want to consider rate, accuracy, and expression. Phonics refers to the ability to map sounds to print and decode unknown words. And I included spelling here because spelling also relies on phonics knowledge, and it's a window into a student's phonemic awareness, which is the ability to be consciously aware of speech sounds and words. So we'll dig into each area a little bit more. Comprehension is complex, and there are many things that contribute to strong comprehension. So, in addition to language comprehension and word recognition, things like executive function and attention certainly play a role. And I really like this quote by Dr. Hugh Katz that says, comprehension performance can't be reduced to a single score because it's not a single thing. So when older students are struggling with comprehension, we are tempted to teach them comprehension strategies. But most of the time, it is either insufficient language or word recognition skills that are the culprit. So we need to ask ourselves, is there a problem with language comprehension, word recognition, or both? Can the student understand it if you read it to them? If yes, then it's likely a problem with word recognition. If they have poor listening comprehension, then we may need to assess language subskills. We must also consider the effort a student is putting in to comprehend the text. Remember, sometimes we don't see the breakdown in comprehension until middle and high school when the text becomes more complex and the student is encountering more unfamiliar words. So if we only measure comprehension in elementary school, we often miss those kids and lose out on crucial years of intervention. So one way to help catch some of those kids is to consider using the oral reading fluency measures, which have a moderate to high correlation with reading comprehension. This quote from Drs. Farrell and Ashby highlights the challenges with using comprehension measures to assess reading skills. They say tests of reading comprehension, such as the benchmark assessment system, Renaissance star reading, smarter balanced assessment tests, which we previously used in Vermont prior to the VTCAP, are diagnostically difficult to interpret. Students perform poorly on comprehension tests for a variety of reasons. It is often tempting to assume that students with poor comprehension require practice identifying the main idea and supporting details. This may be true for some students. However, problems reading words accurately and language skills are much more likely to account for comprehension problems. Vocabulary is also crucial for comprehension because you have to know the meaning of the words you read, right? And we know that not knowing the meaning of as few as 2% of words in a text can impact comprehension. Vocabulary can also be impaired due to a lack of reading experience. So after third or fourth grade, we gain most of our new vocabulary roots through reading, not through oral language. According to one study, on average, children should add 2,000 to 3,000 new words to their reading vocabulary each year. Keith Stanovich coined the term Matthew effects in 1986, and it is a Bible reference that refers to the fact that strong readers read more and become stronger readers, while poor readers read less and the gap widens. Hence, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. One of the areas that can be impacted by this is vocabulary. Sometimes in my work, I will see a student's vocabulary or verbal reasoning score go down on a standardized test over time because of lack of reading experience. So if you have concerns about vocabulary or language skills in general, it's always a good idea to consult with your speech and language pathologist. So let's talk about fluency. There are 3 things we want to consider. First is accuracy. And the research on accuracy tells us that we need to read with 95 to 98% accuracy for independent comprehension. Rate refers to how quickly someone reads. And a fairly recent study from NAEP demonstrated that our fluency rate needs to be close to the 50th percentile for comprehension. That is certainly higher than I realize, I think, than most people realize. They correlated the NAEP scores of fourth graders with oral reading fluency scores and found that those who scored in the proficient range on the NAEP were reading at or above the 50th percentile. The study also found that reading at the 75th percentile optimizes comprehension. Expression means that fluent reading should sound like speech. So sometimes I listen to kids read and they don't pause at punctuation or they rush through certain words that they are unsure about. An expression is really an outcome of having sufficient fluency for comprehension, because if you can read fluently, you can free up your mental resources to think about what you're reading and therefore read it with expression. So fluency is not just about reading fast. All three of these things matter. If a student is reaching the 50th percentile for words correct per minute, but their accuracy is below 95%, we can't ignore it. So what are the teaching implications for a student with poor fluency? Students with poor fluency don't necessarily need a fluency intervention. Oftentimes, fluency issues stem from inefficiencies in decoding. And we can't assume that phonics skills are intact in older students. I have assessed many older students who are not solid with certain sound symbol correspondences. When we think about decoding, assessing nonsense words helps us to identify those who are decoding versus using another strategy such as memorization or context to figure out the word. So skilled readers minimally rely on context. When we use nonsense words, we are essentially looking at someone's ability to decode an unfamiliar word. The errors that they make can help you know where to intervene and be very prescriptive in your teaching. So, in my experience, oftentimes older struggling readers have gaps in foundational decoding skills that would not be evident unless we directly assess them with nonsense words. Many older students also struggle with multisyllabic words because they don't have a strategy to break the word apart into syllables that they recognize. Just think about the number of new multisyllabic words that come up in middle school science and social studies classes. Assessing and teaching morphology can help students read multisyllabic words. So, morphology is the study of meaningful word parts such as prefixes, suffixes, base words, and Latin roots. Skilled readers decode at both the morpheme level and the phoneme level. So, in other words, they're using both sound symbol correspondences and meaningful word parts to break apart an unfamiliar word. So, let's use unpredictable as an example. It has two prefixes, un, which means not, and pre, which means before. It has one suffix, able, which means able to. If a student recognizes those common affixes, they can quickly break apart that word if they've never seen it before. They're left to decode dict, which is a Latin root that means to say or speak. So if they've also learned the meaning of these word parts, then they know that unpredictable means not able to say before. Right? So in this way, morphology also builds vocabulary. Many older struggling readers don't know common affixes, so it can be helpful to assess them so we know where to intervene. If we have an older student who is using compensatory strategies for reading, their spelling is often the area that a teacher is most likely to be concerned about. So if you have concerns about spelling, it's a good idea to take a look at reading fluency and decoding because errors often reflect a lack of automaticity with phoneme grapheme mapping. When a student struggles with spelling, they often have gaps in their phonemic awareness that were never addressed. And in my experience, I would say phonemic awareness is the reading skill that is most often overlooked, especially for older students. So we think it's only appropriate for very young kids. And while it's true that some children will learn to read without direct instruction and phonemic awareness, we do know that the ability to blend and segment sounds and words is highly predictive of future reading success. We also know that efficiency with complex PA skills contributes to reading proficiency in older students. So, this includes the ability to manipulate sounds and words, such as deleting and substituting. So, if we have concerns about decoding and spelling in an older student, we should really be looking at their complex PA skills. I have seen PA instruction be the missing link in an intervention that helps the student continue to progress. The beauty of it is that it only takes about 5 minutes of your intervention time a day to address and practice and instruct PA. So once you've done your diagnostic assessment and you know where you need to intervene, you need to do progress monitoring to monitor a student's growth toward a specific goal. It's frequent and regular assessment on, predetermined schedule, but I do want to quickly describe two kinds of progress monitoring and when they might be useful. So, mastery monitoring measures specific skills and objectives, such as phonics patterns or phonemic proficiency, I was just talking about. So, if you're interested in learning more about mastery monitoring and lesson pacing and how to know when someone has mastered a skill, there's a great blog post on this topic written by my colleagues Peggy Price and Lee Bittler that you can find at the end of my slide deck on the resource page. I linked that there if you want to read more about that. General outcome monitoring provides a broader measure of a student's performance. So ORF is considered a general outcome measure. However, it is not necessarily going to be sensitive enough to show growth in specific skills or provide enough information to determine the necessary instructional adjustments. So sometimes I will see a school plan that uses only ORF to measure progress for students who have not yet mastered very basic phonics patterns. So for example, a student who is struggling with consonant blends and short vowels in fourth grade is not going to show meaningful progress on an ORF test. So in these cases, you really need to be also using mastery monitoring to identify progress. I find that mastery monitoring is also a nice way to share progress with students and families. So for example, in September, Abby was reading 6 out of 10 silent E words accurately, and now she's reading 10 out of 10 silent E words accurately in November. In general, progress monitoring gives us information about the efficacy of the strategies and the approach that we're using. So if we collect the right data, we can be responsive to a student's need in real time and adjust our instructional approach as needed. And so to paraphrase my colleague and friend Peggy Price, she often says, sometimes it may appear that the student is not responding to the intervention when maybe the intervention is not responding to the student. I like that. It makes us think about how we are collecting and thinking about the data. I do want to quickly discuss the importance of considering both accuracy and automaticity when we monitor progress. So accuracy measures whether a student read a word correctly, right? We know that the research tells us we need to read with 95 to 98% accuracy. But automaticity is the ability to read words without conscious effort. Skilled readers read words automatically, which frees up their mental energy to focus on meaning. So to put this into context, a student who is on track to be an automatic reader is reading 60 words per minute by the end of first grade. And most students will have acquired the alphabetic principle at the consolidated level by the middle or end of second grade with intentional systematic phonics instruction in kindergarten and first grade. I think that's a helpful touch point to think about. The consolidated level is Aries phase, which describes when readers read automatically and fluently. So for this reason, we know automaticity is critical for the development of fluency. And so it's important to measure automaticity at the word level for both real and nonsense words. So timed word recognition tasks, such as the Tower 2 or a fluency task on an achievement battery, they're super quick and they help you understand how much effort is being put into decoding. So sometimes I see students who are accurate, but the process of decoding that word is still very laborious. So they are not yet automatic and they cannot yet free up those mental resources to comprehend. So similarly, automaticity is also important for phonemic awareness. And older students who take more than 3 seconds to complete a complex phonemic awareness task likely have underdeveloped phonemic awareness. So that would be a clue to investigate and look more closely at their phonemic awareness skills. Automaticity is defined as fast, accurate, and effortless word identification at the single word level. The speed and accuracy with which single words are identified is the best predictor of comprehension. So I think this quote just serves as a really good reminder that students who struggle with comprehension may not have automatic word recognition skills. And errors matter. All miscue errors are the result of inaccuracies in decoding. So repetition, self-corrections, synonyms, so substituting a word that doesn't change the meaning. Many tests don't count self-corrections or repetitions as errors. However, we know that these types of errors accumulate to impact comprehension. So when you are selecting your assessment, you need to consider what you are counting as errors. If you don't count self-corrections or repetitions as errors, you may be inadvertently determining that a student's fluency is stronger than it really is. So finally, outcome evaluations are summative. They're often at the end of the year. They can be helpful for evaluating systems and long-term data trends. So I put some examples here. They are not super helpful to monitor short-term progress. They can be more helpful in evaluating systems. However, it may take years to see changes in those types of assessments when you were looking to evaluate a system-wide change. So that's something to keep in mind. So now that we've talked about all different types of assessments, you may be asking, how do I know which assessments to use? In my opinion, there is no perfect test. It's not the test itself that is going to make the difference. It is the educator's knowledge about the why and what. So I really like this quote from David Kilpatrick. Because the available tests are not always ideally suited for assessing the various components of reading, the best reading assessment tool is the evaluator's knowledge of research on reading acquisition and reading difficulties. The commercially available assessments are simply tools. So I realize that Kilpatrick is likely referring to a trained evaluator like me who has a background in testing and assessment. However, the important thing is to examine the test you are giving with a critical eye. So if you have a student who's earning an average score on a screening test, but you have concerns about that student in the classroom, I would encourage you to speak up. Talk to your school psychologist or someone knowledgeable about what the test measures. As I mentioned earlier, particularly in the early grades, some of the assessment measures that focus on comprehension miss kids who lack foundational skills. I have a good friend who teaches kindergarten, and in her district, they use the STAR test for screening. And I asked her, I said, how accurate do you feel like the STAR results are in pinpointing the struggling readers? And her response was that it does a good job identifying the kids who are really low, right? But it misses the kids who have gaps or who are moderately below where they should be. Um, and so, luckily she has the knowledge and understanding of how the brain learns to read and what she's looking for, and she's able to give them what they need. So with that being said, there are some important things to consider when selecting your assessment tools. You want to be efficient, right? You want to measure what matters and let go of what isn't helpful, because we all know that instructional time is precious and we want to pick the right tool. Are you giving multiple assessments that measure the same skill? Picking the right tool can save you time from intervening in the wrong area. We want our assessments to be aligned with the evidence, right? We want them to be able to guide instruction. We need to monitor progress and make instructional adjustments based on data. We want our assessments to focus on skills supported by research that are critical for reading development. So, the big five that we discussed. And evidence aligned reading assessments can be norm referenced or criterion referenced. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But evaluating tools for reliability and validity is also important to ensuring that your assessment data is useful and meaningful. So if something is reliable, you are consistently getting the same results. And if something is valid, then it measures what it sets out to measure. Commercially made tests will include information about reliability and validity. Vertically and horizontally aligned assessments allow for direct comparison of skills from one year to the next and across a grade level to more accurately assess the impact of instruction over time. So, for individuals, for classrooms, grade levels, assessment alignment can be very useful in making system wide decisions about curriculum and instruction. So, as I mentioned, evidence aligned reading assessments include both norm reference assessments and criterion reference assessments. So, a norm reference assessment compares a student's performance to their peers. They typically use a sampling of skills to achieve a raw score that is converted to a standard score or percentile rank. So, because it's just a sampling of skills, students can have gaps in foundational skills and still earn an average score, which is why criterion reference tests can also be very helpful. A criterion reference assessment is asking the question: does the student meet a learning criteria? They measure specific skills that are expected to be learned at a certain age or grade level. They can provide more information about mastery of a particular skill. And the scores are often reported in terms of an accuracy percentage. So maybe they got, 8 out of 10 correct. Some tests are both norm referenced and criterion referenced, such as Dibbles, which is now Cadence reading that. That's an example of one that is both norm referenced and criterion referenced. Okay, we're going to do a little quiz to test your knowledge. I want you to think about what type of assessment would be appropriate in each scenario and type your answer into the chat. I gotta make sure I can see the chat here, but here's the first one. Okay. Which of my 25 second graders is on track and or at risk for reading difficulties? Um, Give you another minute. Type it into the chat. Give me your answers. Love it. Yes. Screener. You got it. Universal screener. Oh, you guys are good. Okay. Ooh, someone even said ORF screener. Love it. Okay. A first grader did not meet the benchmark on our universal screener. What skills does she need to be explicitly taught? What type of assessment will we do in this case? Oh, you guys are quick. Love it. Yes, yes, yes. Diagnostic assessment. Perfect. Is our new Tier 1 language arts curriculum effective? What do we think about this one? This one's a little trickier. Good. So I see both, like an end of the year assessment, like an outcome. And then some of you said outcome and universal benchmark, which is what I went with. Okay. Because I think it depends, right? I think an outcome evaluation might take a couple years to show you, is that new curriculum effective, right? You might not see those results after the first year of implementation. But that benchmark, your universal screener that some of you also wrote, could give you information in more real time, right? About what skills do these kids have right now. So I would say that either one of those, depending on your, one being more short term and the outcome evaluation looking at the long term trend. Awesome. You guys got both of those. Is 30 minutes a day of Wilson Reading System effective for this student? We have that question. What kind of assessment do we need in this case? Yes, awesome. Progress monitoring, you guys got it. Great. Thank you so much for your participation and participating in my quiz. You guys nailed it. Okay. So in case you're not sure or you need a little reminder, I really like this cheat sheet, which compares and contrasts the different kinds of assessments and their purpose. So I'm going to give you a minute to look it over, but I also included the website there where you can find it. In fact, if you go to Una Malcolm's website, she has a great article about different purposes of different assessments, and that's actually where I got this chart from. I would encourage you to read it if you're interested. One side note, she is Canadian, so when you look at the outcome evaluation in the bottom right corner, the EQAO is I looked that up and it's a Canadian outcome it's what they use in Canada for their outcome evaluation, so that's what that means. What I really love about this chart is that she puts diagnostic assessments and progress monitoring under assessment for learning, while outcome evaluation is under assessment of learning. And I just think that's a nice way to differentiate them. So definitely check out her website. It's also listed in my references page. So I have a couple pages of references. You will get my slide deck when the recording comes out via email. But I also have some resource pages, which are just, I think, resources that I use when I'm thinking about, sharing information with other stakeholders and educators who have questions about assessment. I think these are all great resources. They cover a variety of topics. So 2 pages of resources here, and these blog posts here. I included the links to those blog posts I told you about that describe how to know when your student has reached mastery and how quickly should you move along in your reading intervention. I think those can be really helpful. So check those out if you're interested. And I'm happy to answer some questions if anyone has questions.
Abby, we did have a question in the chat earlier about what are your thoughts on using curriculum-based assessments or assessments that are included in curriculum and instructional materials?
Yeah, I think curriculum-based assessments can be great tool as long as you know the why and the what that you're measuring, right? So I would, again, going back to thinking about things like running records and informal reading inventories and some of the data that I shared about that, those types of assessments aren't always super valuable. But if you are teaching very explicit skills and you want to measure, and there is an assessment tool built right into that curriculum that is going to give you a measure of progress to use as a progress monitoring tool, I think those are great. as long as you're being really intentional about what you're measuring and you're measuring those key skills that we know are indicators of proficient readers. Yeah, good question.
Another question that just came in is, how often do you recommend progress monitoring?
Yeah, good question. I would say it does depend, but I would say every 6 weeks or so, for more formal progress monitoring. I think a lot of times when you are being really intentional and explicit about teaching, you're always gathering that formative data, right? So you're looking at the errors that are happening and making decisions about what your next lesson is going to look like. So in my mind, that is sort of a different form of progress monitoring. So I think formally, if you're using more of a like a phonics inventory, every 6 weeks you want to take a look and see, okay, I'm going to give you 10 CVC nonsense words and see if you can increase your accuracy, right? And keep track of that. But that doesn't mean that you're not paying attention to that formative data that you're getting through instruction in between. So it's not as if you're not thinking about the progress in between. And I would say a case by case basis. Sometimes you have questions and you want to do it sooner. But I would say 6 weeks on average is a good time period to think about looking at progress. Have any other questions?
There's a couple more questions. There's another question. Are there any recommended resources that links content older kids with improving literacy skills?
Yeah, so one, I'm going to go back here in the slide and make sure I included it that I think is helpful, is the IES guide. Did I hope I included that? Yeah, so the last one here, the Institute of Education Sciences does have a specific link for grades 4 through 9 for intervention, which includes some of that, thinking about how to include the content. And I think, if you're interested in learning more about that, also those knowledge building, I think it's Knowledge Matters. I can't think of what the website is, but the work that Natalie Wexler is doing, if you Google her name and I think Knowledge Matters, and if someone knows and wants to type that into the chat, I think that's a really good resource for thinking about how to incorporate content and background knowledge, if I'm understanding your question correctly. And feel free to say no or clarify. um,
Also, a
oh,
quick question about did you see the progress monitoring question, Abby?
yes, I see
Yeah.
that. Okay, so about the 6 weeks, if the intervention is happening
Yeah.
daily. Yeah, I think yes, I think in general, 6 weeks is a good time period to think about progress. You know, I'm hesitant to say a hard and fast rule because depending on the kid's profile, kids are going to progress at different rates. But obviously, the more that you intervene, just like with anything, the more you do something, the faster you see progress, the better you get at it. Automaticity and fluency is built through reading. So, in theory, you're going to see more growth at the 6 week period if you're intervening every day. So yeah, I think the answer would be yes. Okay. I'm just looking here. I'm trying to see if I can see the chat. There's other questions. Okay.
Do you see them, Abby? There's a couple more at the bottom.
Yeah, okay.
Public library and yeah.
Okay, so decodables for older readers. The decodable text space is blowing up right now. So I personally haven't been able to keep up with them and sort of like vet them for myself, but the Reading League has a great list of decodables, and a lot of them are geared for older readers, so they're chapter books. I love that you work at a library, and I love that you're asking that question, because I would love every library to have a section on for decodable texts, especially for struggling adolescent readers who just really need some of that repetition with particular phonics patterns to become automatic. So check out, if you just go to the Reading League website and go, I don't remember what the tab is under, you'll find it, I think resources or something. There's a great list of decodable text there that you can
Sorry
check
about
out.
that.
Yeah. Okay. And thanks for sharing the knowledge matters and the minding the gap. So can you recommend a diagnostic tool that helps isolate skills that would align to the scope and sequence of explicit instruction for early learners? So that question is a little tricky because, the scope and sequence, it depends on what scope and sequence that you're using. But I think the research would say that we want to look at we want to look at those specific skills that we know are predictive of reading proficiency at certain ages. So for early readers, we're looking at phonemic awareness, and there are tools for that. There's free programs online. One that I often recommend is the David Kilpatrick's Past, although that is more focused on some of the more complex PA skills. Um, there's programs through Hegarty. Um, the PASA, I believe, is still free. And then doing some sort of sound symbol correspondence. We know that being able to name, letter naming is highly predictive of later reading skills. So if you're talking about really young kids, those sorts of diagnostic tools can be really helpful for early learners. Okay. Still have, what time is it? 2 minutes. Okay. I lost my place here. Did I miss one? Did I miss a
Yeah,
question?
there's one here, Abby says, for a student that has low verbal comprehension skills and language skills, in addition to decoding barriers, is there a literacy curriculum program you might recommend in particular?
Yeah, those are the kids that are going to need a lot, right? If they have decoding and language, the biggest thing that I would say before the curriculum itself isn't going to be the magic bullet. One of the things that's really crucial for a kid like that is aligning all service providers. So the classroom teacher, the special educator, if they have one, the SLP, everybody is aligning the work in their oral and written language to focus on those same skills to really wrap around that student, I think is the biggest recommendation I would make for a kid like that. So we're all on the same page. One of the programs that I don't know a lot about, but I've heard can be helpful is language exclamation point, which incorporates some of those language gaps and really starts with phonemic awareness and builds to that sound symbol correspondence. I do think that may be designed for more older students. I'm not sure how old that student is, but that's something to look into. Um, but really, it's just doing a good diagnostic assessment, identifying where those skill gaps are, bringing everybody to the table, and working together to make sure you're all sort of aligning that instruction in the oral and written language so that they're reinforcing each other. I think that would be my biggest recommendation in that case. And Lee, thank you for including that link to the decodable texts and the Reading League. So hopefully you all solved that.
And the
Um,
language, yeah, the
yep.
language
And
resource.
language. Thanks, Lee. I appreciate that. Okay. And then I think Lee is going to put a link to the survey. I'd love your feedback. I'd love to hear what you want to hear more about. And as Brenda said, we'd love to see you on August 19th at the Stern Center for a meet and greet, because it's an we want to hear your ideas and things about how we can support students and educators in Vermont with literacy. So thank you again for being here. Really appreciate it. And my email is here at the bottom. There it is. If you have any questions I didn't get to, or anything, excuse me, anything at all, feel free to send me an email. I'd love to hear from you.
And then tomorrow, please join us. We'll hear from Kara Adwingo, Emily Detzer, and Jennifer Conforti, who are all speech language pathologists. And they're going to talk about school systems to address students' speech, language, and reading needs. And I'm sure you'll get a lot of good information from their presentation tomorrow. So thank you very much.